George Albert Crossman, a short, neatly dressed man, moved into 43 Ladysmith Road, Kensal Rise, in the west of London, around the turn of the years from 1902 to 1903. The modest home was named Sunnyside. With him was his wife, a young blonde-haired woman, and a small child. For a year they were the sole occupants of the two-storey home, until at Christmas 1903 he sublet to a couple named Dell. Crossman moved all his belongings to the upstairs rooms, and the Dells moved into the ground floor. Not long after the Dells moved in, they complained of a disagreeable odour in the house. Crossman agreed that there was a nasty smell, but dismissed it casually as being the drains. The smell persisted, so the Dells checked the drains, but they were clean and not the source of the odour. After some time the Dells complained again to Crossman, but again nothing was done about the problem. Mr. Dell then asked that a cupboard under the stairs be fixed, to which Crossman agreed. Some wooden boards were removed from the space, and behind them were revealed a tin trunk and a beer barrel. The smell in the house was exacerbated by the renovation of the cupboard, and the tin trunk was now identified as the culprit. Mrs. Dell had a sore throat, and the vile air she was breathing made it worse for her. Dell asked for the box to be removed from the house. Although Crossman was in financial difficulties, he agreed to pay for the trunk to be taken away. In mid-March he had some of his furniture seized and sold at auction to repay an outstanding debt, and although he was unaware of it, a detective was planning to interview him on the 24th of March over suspicion that he had defrauded his latest wife, which he had. The removal of the offending item was scheduled for the evening of the 23rd of March, 1904. That afternoon, Crossman obtained a large bottle of scent and liberally sprinkled the trunk with it. Later in the day, he moved it through the hallway and out the front door into the garden. As it dragged along, a foul liquid oozed out and left stains on the floor in its wake. Walter Dell had been apprehensive about the trunk since it was revealed from its place of concealment. Now, looking down at the dark stains which led out into the garden path, he was distinctly uncomfortable, thinking about what the trunk may contain. Crossman went off to fetch a young man named Fred Ryden, who was engaged to remove the trunk at 9 p.m. While he was gone, Dell made a decision. He communicated with the police station in Harvest Road and told the officers of the law what he suspected. By the time Crossman returned with Ryden on a van, a detective and a constable had positioned themselves in shadows on the opposite side of the road to observe what was happening. Crossman leapt off the van 2 houses before his own and told Ryden to follow him. When the van was parked outside number 43, Crossman had already hauled the trunk out onto the footpath and stood smoking a cigar. Ryden went to assist with loading the box onto the van, when he caught a whiff of the putrid smell coming off it. Suddenly suspicious, Ryden exclaimed, "I don't like this, mister." "Nonsense," replied Crossman gruffly. "Don't be a fool. It's only some mouldy cement in the box, and you know how that smells." "Maybe, but I'm not going to shift that box," declared Ryden. At that moment, Crossman noticed the policeman across the road and immediately bolted, running onto the footpath, turning sharply into Dundonald Road, or Crediton Road according to P.C. Reeves, who was doing the chasing. The police set off in pursuit and chased him along the road, following as he turned into Oakhampton and then into Hanover Road, a distance of about 3/4 of a mile. With the police gaining on him, only about 3 yards behind, and capture certain, Crossman reached into his pocket and pulled out a black-handled cutthroat razor. Still running, he cried out, "Oh, God," and raised the blade and slashed his own throat as deeply as he could. In a fountain of blood he slumped to the road. The detective reached Crossman and tried to give assistance, but he had already lost so much blood that there was nothing anyone could do, and Crossman died there on the street. He was 30 years of age. His body was returned to Ladysmith Road, and from there taken to Kilburn Morgue. Ryden was asked to convey the trunk to the police station. There it was opened, and inside, doubled up, was a corpse embedded in cement. The almost naked body was decomposed, and it was at first impossible to tell if it was that of a man or a woman. Once the corpse was pried out of its cement shroud, it was found that a portion of the skull was missing, and it was at first suspected that the person had been struck down with a hatchet. Later it was determined that the throat had been slit. The body was ultimately identified as a woman named Nurse Sampson, aged 38. She was a widow whom Crossman had married on January the 15th, 1903. The following morning, as she was dressing, he murdered his fifth wife after being married less than 24 hours. Crossman's history was revealed, and the dead man was compared to another infamous British wife murderer named Frederick Deeming, who had also concealed the body of one of his wives in cement. Crossman's first wife was Annie Laurie Smith, whom he had married at Kensington in 1896. She had died in 1897, apparently of natural causes. Soon after, he married two women, a Miss Ethel Annie Farley in 1897 at Maidstone, and a Miss Polly Osborne in 1898 at Malden. This act of bigamy came to light during a prosecution on a minor charge. When it was known, Crossman was charged with this crime too. Detective Sergeant Duck of the Metropolitan Police was sent to Crossman's home to arrest him. When Crossman opened the door and found the reason for the sergeant's presence, he said, "Oh, that's all right," and began running throughout the house, pursued by the cop. Finally, he stopped in a room and asked to be left alone for a few minutes. Duck quickly summed up the fact that there was a window in the room, large enough for Crossman to slip out, but small enough to impede the burlier Duck. In the house was Polly, his third wife. Duck found her washing dishes and crying. She explained that they had only just gotten married. Duck explained that Crossman already had a wife and two children at Maidstone. Police said she felt something was wrong, glancing around the barely furnished home they were living in. Outside, Sergeant Duck found something more ominous, which he felt was wrong. In the garden, Crossman had been digging a hole which looked uncannily like a grave. Reflecting after the murder of Nurse Sampson became known, Duck could not help but believe that Crossman had been contemplating murdering Polly in 1898. By 1904, she had found a job as a domestic servant in London. Crossman was found guilty of bigamy and sentenced to 7 years' imprisonment. Ethel, who was his legal wife, divorced him. He was released on parole towards the end of 1902, shortly before he moved into Ladysmith Road. Undeterred by his jail time, he quickly married 4 other women, including the unfortunate Nurse Ellen Sampson, under various aliases. He often found his victims by placing matrimonial advertisements in newspapers. Untangling Crossman's complicated affairs showed that he had married Edith Caroline Thompson on January the 10th, 1903. Edith had been looking for a position as a mother's help when she noticed Crossman's advertisement. He told her he was a reporter with the Morning Post newspaper, earning £150 per annum. 2 days after the wedding, on the 12th of January, he had sent his wife home to her parents in Peckham for a visit, saying he had to go to Manchester on business, and that he did not want her to become lonely in his absence. Thus, he was left free to marry again on January the 15th. Using the alias Charles Seymour, he married Mrs. Sampson, a maternity nurse from Hampshire, at Paddington. She had left her position at Yateley Cottage Hospital, telling her sister-in-law that she was going to remarry. He married the unlucky woman simply to gain access to her savings account. Once he had achieved his aim, he purchased a bushel of cement and arranged for the tin trunk to be delivered a few days later. By the time Edith returned home from her stay with her parents, Nurse Sampson had vanished into some hiding place, thought maybe to have been the coal cellar or a spare room. Crossman retained the nurse's jewellery, umbrella, clothing and other articles, which were later identified at the inquest. Edith, on her return, wondered about the barrel of cement which Crossman told her he needed to make an extra doorstep to the scullery. When she asked about the tin trunk, he reassured her by saying he was using it as a mould for the shape of the doorstep. Edith didn't notice any rank smell, although she was aware of a damp, earthy smell under the stairs. Crossman told her, "Oh, they didn't put enough concrete down." Subsequently, he married for the third time in 1903, this time to Alice Lucilla Venables, and then in 1904 his final wife was Martha Annie Welch, whom he married at Reading. As the investigation unfolded, it was feared that Crossman had killed a string of women, as 2 of his wives were reported to be missing. His 6th wife, Alice, was traced to an address in Richmond, where she lived thinking that her husband was a night baker who could only come home 3 or 4 times a week. She knew him as George Henry Weston. On the day of his death, Crossman and Edith had visited Alice in consequence of a letter arriving from her to him, referring to him as her dear husband. Crossman had somehow convinced Alice to deny that she was married to him when Edith visited. It is not certain if the missing wife, Ethel Farley, was eventually located, but Crossman was not accused of any other murders, except for Nurse Sampson. A newspaper in 1919 claimed that police believed that Crossman may have killed 3 women in all, but gave no evidence. Martha Welch, his final bride, is believed to have had a lucky escape, however. A newspaper interviewed her at the time, which provided some insight into Crossman and his methods. She had seen one of his advertisements referring to himself as a widower, using the name Frank Seaton, and saying he was an electrician, and she answered it as a joke. However, after meeting him, she thought he was really nice and took a fancy to him. After going out together for 2 months, at the age of 19, she married him. Following their wedding, they went to 43 Ladysmith Road and remained there 9 days. The Dells were, it seems, away during this time. On February 3rd, 1904, they went to Whitstable for 1 day, before he took her to an isolated furnished property he rented at Herne Bay. The houses either side of the house he rented were vacant, and although other properties were offered, Crossman wanted the isolated house. He unnerved her by silently following her around the house, and she alleged he was brutal to her. After a week of marriage, he forced her to drink whiskey to keep him company, even though she was a teetotaler. One night she refused the drink, whereupon he tied her hands behind her back and forced the drink down her throat. He had also, without her knowledge, had a large linen basket she used to keep dresses in, brought from Kensal Rise to Herne Bay. She discovered it one day in the back sitting room, quite empty, which in retrospect was uncannily like a trunk or a coffin. Due to his behaviour and a fear of the basket, she abruptly left him during a walk. She feared he was not right in the head and that he meant to strangle her and put her in the basket. She kept her fears to herself, thinking if she told anyone, they would think she was suffering from delusions. He tracked her down the next day to a boarding house, but she asked that if he knocked, nobody answered the door. Then she left for Reading, but again he found her, and this time cajoled her to return to him at Ladysmith Road. She gave in, feeling foolish for having such melodramatic thoughts about her husband, and did so. Returning to Ladysmith Road on the 26th of February, Martha found that a Mrs. Edith Crossman was living there with her baby. Frank, as she knew him, explained that Edith was his cousin, and that she was there because her husband was a bad sort. Martha found her husband's behaviour with Edith too familiar for cousins, and said so to him. She did not suspect that Edith was also his wife. He had told Edith that she had to pretend to be his cousin, as Martha had come to adopt Bertie, his young son by his first wife, and she would not take the boy if she knew he was married. Martha had not seen the trunk nor noticed a smell until the 21st of March. When she complained, her husband went into the cupboard and could be heard hammering at something. She later thought he was trying to chip the body out of the cement. On the night of his suicide, she was in her room playing games with little Bertie. The door was shut to keep the stench out, and she didn't know anything of what had happened until Dell came up and informed her of Crossman's suicide. It appeared that his motive in marrying the women was to enable himself to steal their money. Police had questioned Martha on the 22nd of March about her name being forged on a withdrawal slip. Crossman had used it to steal her life savings of £53. He was also revealed to have repeatedly defrauded furniture dealers by getting goods from them, for which he never paid, before selling them himself and pocketing the cash. At the inquest into Crossman's suicide and of Nurse Sampson's murder, Crossman's mother, Mary Ann Crossman, gave evidence that there was no insanity in their family. Rather, she stated her son had been too intelligent. Certainly, he had managed to convince women to marry him, even though they barely knew him, and was able to persuade them readily to believe his lies. Her son had been a baker, a barber, and a barman, as well as a confidence stricter and a marrying man. He never stayed in one place for very long, she said. She had seen him when he called on her on the morning of his last day on earth, when he had seemed depressed. He commented that he was not fit for anything and no good to himself or anyone else. She said he had been haggard and restless for weeks leading up to the fateful day. Asked about the tin trunk, she said she knew it well. It had belonged to his first wife. A verdict of suicide was returned, and it was added that he was not insane at the time. The jury then heard from the divisional police surgeon that the body of Ellen Sampson had been clad in undergarments, but only one stocking. The cause of death was difficult to establish. The damage to the skull suggested a blow had felled her, but strangulation could not be ruled out. He could not say how long the body had been embedded in the cement. One bizarre feature was announced in court. The top of Ellen's skull was missing, as was her hair. Her brain had been removed from the skull, wrapped in a cloth, and returned to the cavity. The finding of the coroner's court was that Ellen Sampson had been willfully murdered by Crossman. Crossman was buried at Willesden Cemetery on the 30th of March, one day after his victim was interred in the same grounds. A hearse delivered him in a plain elm coffin in the early morning sunshine. The only mourners were his mother and his sister, although a small crowd of curious onlookers stood outside the cemetery gates. After a brief service from a nonconformist minister, the two bereaved ladies went and stood for a moment at the grave of Crossman's first wife, who was buried nearby, before they slowly and sorrowfully walked away. Lady Smith's Road name was changed, and today is known as Wrentham Avenue, but the memory of the cruel deeds done there long ago remain in the dark corners of history.